He was suspended without pay last week from the University of Lethbridge in Alberta, Canada, after somebody shared a Jewish hate post on his Facebook page. Professor Anthony Hall is one of the world's experts on Native American history and author of Earth into Property. He's Skyping, calling into us right this very second, but we can't bring him up on the desk. There's no sound, I'm afraid. We'll try and get him on the phone. Yes, he's the author of Earth into Property on the privatisation of America by the colonists in the Indian Wars, but he's also an outspoken critic of the official narrative of 9/11. He teaches students the war on terror is nothing but an excuse to undermine international law so the US can invade any country it feels like. This is a case, one of those typical cases, in fact, of academic freedom. He's been targeted because somebody else, believe it or not, put a hate post up on his Facebook page.
Well, it's not even clear who would have put such a hate post up on his Facebook page. Somebody that was targeting him could put the hate post up on his page and then claim that he's done nothing about it and therefore he has to be punished by the authorities of his university. Probably he is being targeted because of his controversial views, and it's fairly clear that it's the pro-Israel Zionist lobby, B'nai Brith in this case, who are unhappy with what he's saying and are trying to get him taken off the, basically lose him his job, even though he's got tenure at the university there. And this has happened to quite a few academics who've questioned 9/11 and also, been controversial from a Zionist point of view in criticising the state of Israel. The state of Israel is incredible, and its supporters are incredibly litigious and rather tricky. So in any case, as you say, it's not his post on the Facebook page which has led to him being suspended from his job. Are we responsible for what other people put up on our Facebook pages? No doubt there's going to be an appeal and a discussion about this.
Well, for whatever reason, it's not coming through here on the desk. We can see him. He can hear us and everything, but we can't hear him, so there's no point in putting him through. You can't hear what he's saying at all. So let's have a listen now to some of Anthony's previous comments from a talk he did a few years ago. The talk was entitled, "Is War Really a Remedy for Terror?"
As I'm coming to see it, the exposure of the lies and crimes of 9/11 cuts so deeply, they so discredit such a sweep of the ruling class that there is something profoundly subversive and revolutionary in our movement. And I think we need to talk about I think we've actually done it. I think the hard work has actually happened. When I go to conferences with learned professors and whatnot, when I'm with people who are opportunists, careerists, want cracks on mainstream media, want government contracts, you're not going to get that by exploring these issues of what really happened on 9/11. So it's not a good career move to go into this area. And I was glad to see the university politics, the academic politics that Professor Stephen Jones has faced on his campus and that I face on my campus when, for instance, Jonathan Kay attacks my graduate student when he gets a small scholarship, $7,000, Joshua Blakeney, to study 9/11 skepticism, the origins of the 9/11 wars. And we're attacked in Canada by the most powerful press machinery in the country. But my administration is holding with me. And so we can do this in the curriculum, and we're developing this in the curriculum. I'm not emeritus. I'm teaching on Wednesday night. So I'm taking responsibility for this. What are the other questions? Anybody think there's another basic question that comes up when you say, well, I'm pursuing 9/11 truth? Why? Like you run into, well, look, there's famine, poverty, financial debacles, war, every kind of rape and pillage all over the planet. Why would you take this one issue when there's so many other important issues? Well, I think those of us who've come to the conclusion that we put our emphasis here understand, look, we're lied to all the time. We know that. As children, we had to figure it out very early in life. You're just lied to on the media all the time. So what's the big deal? So there's some lies involved here. I think there's a understanding among us that this particular category of lies, this complex of lies, is so audacious. It's so diabolical. It's so comprehensive, and it's not rocket science to look at Building 7 and say that's a controlled demolition. We can argue about, was it nanothermite, was it this or that, but the larger picture, NORAD, what is the history of Al-Qaeda, what happened at the Pentagon, why was Bush in the bunker and was Cheney in the bunker and Bush in Florida, on and on and on. There's not one element of the official story that really stands up. So we have come to the conclusion that we're not going to let this category of lies go past us. And I think we can give ourselves a hand. And we will stand together, and we will protect each other, and we will watch each other's backs. Because there is a certain danger right now, and that is such a horrible commentary on the violation of the principles of the UN Charter, that what happened here in 1945, the principles of common decency, the principles of the rule of law.
Well, I mean, it's a shame that we haven't got him live, but of course that was an audio recording of his position, and you can see that he's taking a strong and determined position about 9/11. And also other issues, the war on terror. And I'm afraid one of the reasons why senior academics don't speak out is because they know it's more than their job's worth to tell the truth. But some people have got the guts to tell the truth anyway, and he's one of them.
Well, if you remember, back a few years ago, we had a tour from Guy Fawkes' 9/11, and we booked it in. This is Webster Tarpley talking about 9/11, his analysis of those attacks at Bristol University. A few days before the talk was due to happen, they said, we're not allowing this lunatic to use our lecture theatre. So we had to then find somewhere. Actually, it was QEH across the road. We're fine about it. But, this sort of thing is about trying to control any kind of real discussion and debate within the highest echelons here at Bristol University, as well as over in Lethbridge, of interpreting September the 11th attacks. These are elite institutions, and they seem to be controlled by the same people who are behind the war on terror.
Well, if you do a thought experiment, if 9/11 was an inside job, you can imagine that the people who carried it out are quite determined that people are not going to ask questions about it. So anybody who does ask questions about it is punished. And therefore, those who might be inclined to speak out then realise that their jobs are at risk, their mortgages are at risk, and it's you don't even need to tell people in many academic institutions what not to talk about if you want to keep your job. And occasionally, of course, somebody has to be thrown to the lions to make sure that the message is taken on board. And then, of course, they say, well, nobody's criticising us. Then there's no academic criticism. It's not there's no academic criticism because those who do criticise are thrown overboard.
So Anthony Hall is also an expert in Native American studies, and he makes the point of the whole war on terror is like an extension of the Native American Indian wars. Do you think that's stretching a point, Martin?
Well, I mean, there's a continuity there, is there not? Underlying all of this is greedy, powerful oligarchies who are determined to control the world's resources in their own interest.
Well, he's also talking about the names of tribes and specific individuals in those Indian wars, Indian tribes that have been co-opted by the current US military.
These helicopters might be called Black Hawk or Apache. And of course, the most famous Apache was Geronimo. And when Geronimo was the code name given to Bin Laden, or the impersonator of Bin Laden, or the faux Bin Laden, that was very significant. Prescott Bush took Geronimo's, he robbed the grave in 1918 and literally took the skull to the Skull and Bones Club. So that naming of Bin Laden, Geronimo, that's what I start the paper that I wrote for this presentation with. So this text here, the cover, the reality that indigenous peoples in North America who fought the expansion of the American empire and the transcontinental expansion of the United States of America is an imperial land grab, and it was genocidal. And ironically, those who opposed and fought it Like, for instance, Black Hawk, who was an Indian man in the Illinois area. You know, he has a weapon named after him, a helicopter named after him, the Apache helicopter. Of course, Geronimo was in the custody of the United States of America for much of his life, for decades, and the United States could never say, is he a domestic prisoner who broke the laws of the United States, or is he an international prisoner? Is he a prisoner of war? And so the issues that come up in Guantanamo are very old in the history of this country. And the expansionary impulse of the American empire is very deeply rooted in the Indian Wars.
That's Professor Tony Hall, who's been suspended without pay up in Alberta, Lethbridge University. And I hope he's joining us on the phone now. Hi, Tony, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, fantastic.
I hear you perfectly. Do you hear me?
Yes, we do. Anyway, if you could just briefly tell us what's the latest with the whole your suspension. Are you going to get your job back or what?
You know, I'm still a professor. I'm a suspended tenured professor, which seems to be an internal contradiction. And I think this reflects very significantly on the jurisdiction where my school is, the University of Lethbridge is, because there is a new legislation brought in that apparently gives university presidents the capacity to simply suspend a faculty member based on whatever whim that president might have.
Well, but you can understand that. They're supposed to be running the university. They're in charge. Why shouldn't they suspend you?
Well, of course, there is at universities this institution called tenure. There is a need to protect those researchers who study things and come up with conclusions from their research which may not be well received by power. For instance, you know, Galileo at one point started saying, well, Copernicus is right. Actually, the sun, you know, is the center, not the earth. And, you know, he was under house arrest for the rest of his life. So this institution of tenure is, you know, it's an international institution. When you go through this process, specialists in your specific field are assembled. They may be in Botswana or, you know, South Africa or Lithuania or Japan or wherever. So it's a very international aspect of the academy, which is to say that at the highest level of the academy, it's not just a little local thing under the thumb of some politician or some schmoozer. You know, there is 500 people have signed a petition saying that the chairman of the Board of Governors at the University of Lethbridge, Kurt E. Schlachter, should resign because he did not protect academic freedom.
But, Tony, what's happened here is that you have actually done things like linked the September the 11th attacks to the Israelis. I mean, how can you possibly do that?
Well, you know, I can read Christopher Bolin. I can see the different publications and the different postings of Alan Sabrowski. You know, my colleague on False Flag Weekly News, Dr. Kevin Barrett, takes a similar position. And, of course, you know, what happened on 9/11 is contested. But to my way of thinking, the strongest interpretation is that the Israel First neocons, the project for the new American century, the Netanyahu government, which is Likudnik, which is very, you know, going back to, you know, bombing of the King David Hotel and is very much centered on scientific use of terrorism, that there's no question that the most compelling interpretation of who did 9/11 is Israel First neocons to demonize Muslims, to produce a new enemy. After the demise of the Soviet Union, there is the military-industrial complex, core of the political economy of the United States, without an enemy. Israeli First neocons essentially supply the enemy. They create this false flag event on 9/11. Isn't it interesting that the first announcement of what's happening comes from Ehud Barak, the former prime minister, Labour prime minister of Israel, who just happens to be in the BBC studios and just happens to announce before even the Twin Towers fall, in that interval after they're hit by whatever they're hit by, and you know, they're going to collapse. But before that, there he is saying, we need a war on terror. Osama bin Laden is the most obvious suspect. He basically lays out the whole scenario for what we now call the global war on terror, and we have that same interpretation given by, the Blair government, the Cameron government, the Harper government, the Trudeau government, people of great scholarly merit like Professor David Ray Griffin, like Peter Dale Scott. I would count myself among that group. I publish on this in a peer-reviewed text, a big book called Earth into Property. I spoke on that text when I came to London in 2011, and I believe you were playing tapes from my time in London. So I'm a scholar. I'm 65 years old. I've, published. I have a very strong publishing record. And whether Mike Maughan, the president of the University of Lethbridge, who is a phys ed teacher who's kinesiology, he's just arrived in town recently, whether he thinks it's kind of weird that I say Israel had a role in 9/11, well, my scholarly credentials are beneath that assertion, and, a lot of research is beneath that assertion. And we don't know in every detail how it was done, who did it, but we know the neocons, Israel First faction, like Michael Chertoff, who was in charge of the investigation on behalf of the Justice Department. He was in the crucial chair. He transformed the investigation into the crime of 9/11 into a cover-up. Very early on, the Steal, which is an evidence of what it is that made those buildings come down in the very peculiar way that they came down, where they sort of burst into talcum powder and vapor. And, where did the energy come from? Was it, melting steel and gravity? That just is not credible. And so the evidence of the steel being carted away under Chertoff's control, he is a Israeli, U.S. dual citizen, Dov Zakheim, Richard Pearl, Netanyahu himself, who in 1979 organizes the Jerusalem Conference on Terrorism and sort of invents this scenario of international terrorism and starts to say this is the scenario that the West has to direct and control to win terrorism, how the West can win, the book that comes out of this Jerusalem Conference of 1979.
But surely, you're actually one of the only people around the world who's a professor that's saying this stuff. Surely all the other 99% of professors can't be wrong, Tony.
Well, the other 99% of professors just kind of avoid the subject. When you really get down to who will actually defend the official story, one of them is Michael Shermer. He came and spoke at our university. And, of course, this technique of saying, well, conspiracy theorists, it's kind of a mental illness. He's showing pictures of brains. He's saying, they think this and that about Mars, or this about that about Elvis, or this or that about the Holocaust, or this about 9/11, connecting all these issues. And, it's really a disgrace. And so Michael Shermer, I stood up and said, you are a disgrace to the academy. He actually came from Claremont University, where David Ray Griffin, who's written 10 serious books, Professor Griffin, a very senior, esteemed, genuine academic. This Michael Shermer is speaking at my university like a TV professor. He's on Oprah. He's on all these TV shows. And he's invited to my university. It's really humiliating to see that. And so I said, this is not a professor, a genuine professor. I wrote to his dean. He advertised himself as adjunct professor of economics. The dean wrote back and said, I don't even know who this person is.
Well, look, Anthony, people can still follow you, can't they? Because you do some sort of internet newspaper and also the False Flag Weekly News. Whereabouts is that?
Well, False Flag Weekly News is produced by No Lies Radio. We just did this week's version of it. So for the last 2 weeks, one of the big subjects is to report from the trenches, as it were, about what's going on at the University of Lethbridge. This story is becoming international in scale. There's obviously a problem with our universities. We talk a lot about the corruption of the mainstream media and the Zionist bias in the mainstream media from, for instance, the Rupert Murdoch press. But universities are, strangely kind of silent, and it's not a good career move, for instance, to address 9/11.
Well, as you've found. But what about your internet newspaper? What's that?
Well, it's called American Herald Tribune. I'm editor-in-chief of American Herald Tribune, and if you go there, you'll see the perspective that I've been developing, and colleagues like Kevin Barrett and Rafiq, also known as Robert S. Lewis, have been developing. So we're creating a record of this ongoing saga of crushing the institution of tenure and trying to take universities more severely than they already are under control. In this case in Lethbridge, it's the Brith, part of the Anti-Defamation League of Brith, a very old, rich, powerful organization. And basically this organization emanates from the government of Israel. And even in the mission statement of the Brith candidate, said its mission, its purpose, is to advocate for the security of Israel.
But your president at your university, or principal or whatever, is worried that you're teaching young revolutionaries.
Well, I would not talk this way in my class. I assume that you're calling me and you have some background in this, and I know who you are. And, I talk on Press TV about twice a week. And, the Press TV out of the Islamic Republic of Iran, out of Tehran, it's an international network. But we know that the Islamic Republic of Iran is right in the sights of Israel. And, Sheldon Adelson said it should be nuked, and Hillary Clinton seems to agree. There is a sort of imperative to identify what's really going on here, this building up of the imagery of Islamic terrorism. Of course, this is a big media scam. It's sometimes referred to as the Islamophobia industry. It needs to be identified. But really, this important stand that I'm able to do this at the University of Lethbridge, people have, said, how can you do that? And I had an understanding with, for instance, Andy Haken, who is, understands. I've had a graduate student who's from London area, Joshua Blakeney, who's quite well known in some circles. My original breakthrough on 9/11 came as a result of Mohawk activists splitting the sky, sort of persuading me I have to work on this. When Splitting the Sky attempted a citizen's arrest of George W. Bush in 2009. Kevin Barrett was very much present. I worked with Cynthia McKinney, the former congresswoman.
Okay, Tony, can you just give us we're going to have to finish there. Can we just give us your websites finally, please, so people can have a look at some of your work?
Well, check this out at the American Herald Tribune. I'm going by the name Professor Tony Hall. There's a backlog of stories. We do it every week on False Flag Weekly News. The trouble here for me in Lethbridge started last summer when a journalist by the name of J.W. Schnarr wrote an article on the front page called Conspiracy Theory. If you want to see the smear on me, there's a website called Canary Mission. I'm
actually more interested in some of the things that you've said that have caused the trouble. That's, I think, much more interesting. But anyway, look, Anthony, we've got your False Flag Weekly News and your newspaper as well. Thanks very much for joining us. Finally, we managed to get around to you on the Politics Show here. Thanks. Martin, this is all really about academic freedom, isn't it?
It is. And, of course, when people like Professor Hall, who are actually, senior academics, are booted out of their roles like this, it sends a clear message to younger people who are studying in universities about what their career prospects will be if they try and ask questions about these matters. But ultimately, of course, this kind of intimidation is not to be tolerated. We need to speak freely about things, honestly about things, and some people may not like what they hear, but that's just too bad, isn't it?
BCFM. Now, German terror suspect Jabbar al-Bakr's jail death is a scandal. This is a terrorist suspect apparently killed himself in jail this week, Martin.
Yeah, isn't it interesting that people that carry out these terrorist attacks supposedly end up dead, so that they can't tell any tales about who recruited them or whether they were guilty? What amazes me more
than anything else is that nobody in the mainstream press at all has suspected, well, maybe these German police are crooked and they've killed him.
Well, that's more, nobody asks these questions about all sorts of things. The issues are that, as you well know, it's not just 9/11. Many of these so-called terror events have very, very suspicious backgrounds.
Well, we've also had the Deep Cut Barracks, the second of the re-inquests with this guy who's supposed to have committed suicide by shooting himself in the chest 5 times.
As you do. And, of course, what tends to happen, of course, is that certain people can be need to be eliminated because they know too much.
Okay,
and that's the kind of thing that happens.
Finally, on our international section here, 40 million people in a massive drill in Russia. The Russians are gearing up for potential nuclear war. 40 million people involved in this drill last week. The Germans and the Swiss are saying stuff your basements full of canned food and that sort of thing. What's happening here in Britain?
Well, we're living in a bubble where none of this is happening, although we've been told this week that we're going to get very, very upset about Syria, but we don't dare do anything about it. And, of course, we're not really confronting the fact that it's quite like the British intelligence services who helped to start the war in Syria.
There's very little talk, is there, about the offer of the Russians and the Syrians to allow all of the al-Nusra out of East Aleppo with their guns, but then they refuse to go.
Well, that's why we've not heard about it, because why wouldn't they want to go if they wanted to save? What they're doing is they're holding the civilians there as hostages and human shields. And that's exactly what the Israelis accused Hamas of doing in Gaza a few years ago, if you remember. And I don't think in actual fact that the Syrian and Russian air forces are doing anything like as devastating an attack on East Aleppo as Israelis carried out on Gaza.
One of the people behind all this, of course, is the US Army Chief of Staff, who is Mike Miles, I believe, and he had this to say. Maybe you'd just like to comment on him before we have the clip.
Well, he's not the only one. Lots of senior US military personnel are bloviating and trying to create as much tension as possible. And that's because Obama's a lame duck president and the Pentagon are now running the policy without any supervision from the White House.
I want to be clear to those who try to oppose the United States. I want to be clear to those who wish to do us harm. I want to be clear to those around the world who want to destroy our way of life and that of our allies and friends. The United States military, despite all our challenges, despite our op-tempo, despite everything we've been doing, will stop you and we will beat you harder than you've ever been beaten before. Make no mistake about that. Other countries, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, went to school on us. They closely watched how we fought in 91 and 03. They studied our doctrine, our tactics, our equipment, our organization, our training, and our leadership. And in turn, they revised their own doctrines, and they are rapidly modernizing the militaries today to avoid our strengths in hopes of defeating us at some point in the future. Recently, a senior Russian official, ambassador to the United Kingdom, Alexander Karamenko, he said, quote, "The established world order is undergoing a foundational shakeup with the Crimea, Ukraine, and Brexit." He went on to call for the dismantling of NATO and the European Union. And he said, quote, "Russia can now fight a conventional war in Europe and win. Russia is the only country that will remain relevant forever. Any other country is dispensable, and that includes the United States. We are endgame now," end quote. We can now, and we will remain in the future, retain the capability to rapidly deploy, and we will destroy any enemy, anywhere, anytime. Additionally, the battlefield will be highly complex, almost certainly in dense urban areas, and against an elusive, ambiguous enemy that combines terrorism and guerrilla warfare alongside conventional capabilities mixed with large civilian populations.
So that's the US Army Chief of Staff there with a pretty horrific warning for us all. Yeah, we can obliterate anybody whenever we feel like it. Sounds like almost like he's trying to take us back to the days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Anyway.
Getting bigger by being better. The #1 choice for Bristol. This is BCFM 93.2.